BBC. For more information and terms of use, go to bbc.co.uk/podcasts.
The engaging arabesque, a piece with a smile on its face, full of warmth and good humour, like the man who wrote it, Carl Nielsen. You might have called the set it comes from 5 easy pieces, but they were actually published as just 5 piano pieces, music intended for children. They mark a departure for Nielsen, literally, since he completed the set during his first trip away from his native Denmark in 1890. These months were to be a life-changing experience in which the young musician was able to spread his wings and expand his musical and artistic horizons as he headed for Berlin. He had his photograph taken there, the better to impress publishers and impresarios. He looks bright-eyed and very young, his thick shock of hair relatively tamed for once, as if he'd made an attempt to comb it. From Berlin, he went on to Leipzig, Dresden, and Paris, and it was in the French capital that he met, fell in love with, and quickly married the Danish sculptor Anne-Marie Brodersen. Nielsen was 25, and he'd already made an impression back home, in particular with his Little Suite for Strings, in which he'd played second violin in the orchestra at its premiere in 1888, and made his conducting debut with it a few months later. You can imagine his delight when the middle movement, a waltz intermezzo, was so well received it had to be encored. The music which brought Carl Nielsen his first public success. For the last decade of his life, and for many years after his death, Nielsen's music was hardly heard outside Scandinavia. Audiences in this country really had to wait until the middle of the last century, 20 years after Nielsen's death, before the real breakthrough came with a performance of his Fifth Symphony at the 1950 Edinburgh Festival. Thereafter, his music was championed by the Nielsen expert Robert Simpson, who was responsible for many broadcasts of Nielsen's music while he worked as a producer at the BBC, and by conductors like Leonard Bernstein and Herbert Blomstedt. And it was through his symphonies, first and foremost, that Nielsen's reputation was established. But there's a lot more to Carl Nielsen than the 6 symphonies he composed over the course of his life. And this week, whilst I'll be dipping into his symphonies along the way, I'll offer you the chance to hear highlights from his 2 operas, a selection of his chamber music, and some of the choral works and the vast collection of songs for which he's best known in Denmark. His earliest known song dates from around 1883, but it was 10 years later that his first 2 published collections came out. Although his third collection was written, like the previous 2, for the concert hall, the style was much simpler. He set a number of texts by Ludwig Holstein, which weren't about refined literary types, but ordinary working people. Many of Nielsen's songs have a broad, warm, ingratiating way with them, moving, as one of his fellow countrymen put it, with the easy stride of a farmer on his own land. few more so than his setting of Holstein's Song Behind the Plough. One critic at the time sneered at this as evidence of Nielsen's morbid craving for originality. But as so often, audiences were way ahead of the critics, and the song was soon heard well beyond the concert halls.
I solen går jeg bag min lov, jeg nikker til den grønne skov, hvor du min lykke gemmer dig, mit hjerte lir og gemmer sig, og gemmer sin lyksalighed, til sol går ned, til sol går ned.
Axel Schütz recorded there in 1938 with the pianist Christian Christiansen in Carl Nielsen's Song Behind the Plough. For Nielsen, the life of the country ploughman wasn't a poetic posture. It was a world he knew, and it was no country idyll. He grew up not in sophisticated Copenhagen, but on the large Danish island of Funen, where, according to Nielsen, everything is different from the entire rest of the world. He was born the seventh of 12 children in a farm labourer's cottage, which he described as a mere hovel, and they shared it with another family. The Nielsens were squeezed into 2 rooms and a kitchen. His father, Niels the painter, supplemented his meagre wages as a part-time house painter, taking whatever work came his way, playing fiddle and cornet at weddings and parties. Times were often hard, and the children sometimes knew real hunger. Nielsen's earliest experiences of performing in public were of playing violin alongside his father at village dances. As he grew up, there were jobs as gooseherd and cowherd, working in a brick factory and as a grocer's assistant. But just as the grocer went bust, his father drew his attention to an audition for a bugler's post in the army. Even at 14, Nielsen beat 2 older boys to the job, based in Odense, the main town on Funen. After 4 years, he was encouraged to audition for the Royal Danish Conservatoire of Music in Copenhagen. In 1884, he was admitted as a student with an exemption from paying fees and with great expectations. But what he dreamed about for so long proved, in reality, to be a big disappointment, not helped by the fact that he had no formal tuition at the Conservatoire in the area where his greatest talents lay, composition. It was only once he left that he began to compose in earnest. After he graduated, Nielsen kept himself afloat giving piano lessons and working as a freelance violinist. Then he got a permanent job as one of the second violins in the orchestra of the Royal Theatre. Less than a year later, he won the scholarship that allowed him to set off on his travels in September 1890. As well as meeting and falling head over heels in love with the woman who would become his wife, Nielsen also got to know many of Europe's leading musicians, and he was able to experience at first hand the musical, literary and artistic trends of the time. Immediately after he and his wife Anne-Marie got back from their honeymoon, Nielsen threw himself into composing his first symphony. According to Robert Simpson, Nielsen's Symphony No. 1 shows that he was already clear as to his real path as a composer, for it displays the principle of evolving tonality. Put simply, it starts in one key and ends in a completely different one. Indeed, Simpson says, it might not be going too far to say that it's probably the most highly organized first symphony ever written by a young man of 27. Like watching a child playing with dynamite is how one critic reacted to hearing that music for the first time. A great leap forward for Carl Nielsen, the first movement of his Symphony No. 1, which we heard performed there by the Gothenburg Symphony Orchestra, conducted by Myeon-won Chung. It went down very well indeed at the premiere, and Nielsen found himself dubbed our surest musical talent and the young prince of music by the Danish press, though there was at least one dissenting voice. It was the critic Charles Kierulf who regarded the music as potentially explosive. He denounced the symphony's harmonies and modulations as unsettled and brutal, and thus began a lifelong animosity towards Nielsen and his music. One of the impressions from that formative European journey, together with the experience he gained playing in the Royal Theatre Orchestra, resulted in an urge to compose on a larger scale. The memory of a picture by Titian, a scene of terrible physical violence in The Miracle of the Jealous Husband in Padua, where a man stabs his wife to death, was the inspiration for a work which would combine orchestra with choral forces and soloists. In Hymnus Amoris, A Hymn to Love, Nielsen depicts the four ages of man: childhood, youth, manhood, and old age, with love as the unifying force behind all of them. He set out, as he put it, to let the various ages praise the power of love and let it find its fulfillment and glorification in the image of the otherworldly. Each section of the cantata is sung in Latin by a choir of a different age group. Children sing of love having given them life, and mothers of the children growing under its guidance. A tenor represents youth, for whom love is his craving and desire, shining like a guiding star. A male choir stands for manhood, singing of love as a spring on whose banks grow valour and strength. But in an aria-like passage, a solo woman's voice reminds us that love can also mean grief. Nothing can hurt us so much, yet be so precious to us.
You're listening to the podcast version of BBC Radio 3's Composer of the Week with Donald MacLeod.
He plays his violin and nods on his flower chair. His leg is his fiddle bow, and his wing his violin. Carl Nielsen's little picture of a grasshopper. Throughout his life, Nielsen wrote two distinct kinds of music: pieces for the concert hall or theatre, and popular songs for non-professional groups and individuals. From his mid-30s onwards, he was constantly being asked to write works for unaccompanied voices for use in schools and by amateur choirs. One of the most popular of his school pieces was Grasshopper for two-part choir. It enjoyed such runaway success when it was first published that for a while his daughters were nicknamed the Grasshoppers by their school friends. Nielsen's relationship with the theatre was no love affair. He worked for more than 15 years in the ranks of the second violins in the orchestra of the Danish Royal Theatre in Copenhagen. Eventually, he'd been appointed conductor of the orchestra, but he had to share the post with Frederik Rung, for whom he wrote the first of those settings. Rung was his main antagonist at the Royal Theatre. He couldn't have been more different from Nielsen, dogged, systematic and thorough. When he died in 1914, Nielsen was so outraged by the way the authorities handled the situation, not appointing him as conductor-in-chief, that he resigned. Nielsen was in constant demand as a composer of music for the stage and wrote incidental music for many plays throughout his life, but by far his most important music for the theatre is in his two operas. The first, back in 1902, while Nielsen was still playing violin in the Royal Theatre Orchestra, had been a highly dramatic biblical piece, Saul and David. Like a number of other works by Nielsen, this too seems to have had a visual inspiration, in this case a painting of David and Goliath by the Renaissance painter Pollaiolo. This great and remarkable story, as Nielsen called it, had obsessed him to such an extent that he'd been unable to think of anything else. Even when I was sitting there in the orchestra playing second violin in ballets and vaudevilles, he said years later. At the opera's core is the confrontation between Philistines and Israelites, and between King Saul and the shepherd David, exact opposites of each other. Something of the jealousy and rivalry between them is mirrored in the relationship between Nielsen and his librettist, the journalist Einar Christiansen, who was a personal friend. But a rift developed between them, the writer aloof and somewhat pompous, and the young composer whom he regarded as an upstart, young, trusting, but impetuous. It's Saul's wild mood swings which carve out the dramatic shape of the opera. In the first act, the prophet Samuel denounces Saul for his profanation of God's law, and he prophesies that the scepter will fall from his hand. Saul sings defiantly that Jehovah is evil, and so is he, the Lord Jehovah made him. We'll join the act at the moment where his son Jonathan brings his friend, the shepherd David, to sing to the king and soothe his soul. Although the audience responded with huge enthusiasm, they refused to leave the theatre after the first performance until the lights were finally switched off in the theatre and the safety curtain lowered. Saul and David was taken off after only 2 performances. The newspapers had given it a savaging, and the theatre management had taken against it too. They wanted more popular fare. Nielsen must have been very frustrated at having to go back to his old clothes, as it were, as a rank-and-file orchestral musician after his major success as an opera composer and the not insignificant accolade that the Royal Theatre had allowed him to conduct the performances himself. Yet, writing to his wife, who wasn't there to witness his triumph, she was working in Athens at the time, he told her that he would now go forward with my work, for I know what I can do now. Well, the Danish government at least recognised the significance of what he'd achieved as a composer when, in 1901, they awarded him an official stipend to support his work, but it wasn't anything like as generous as the one the Finnish government gave Sibelius. It was gratifying in principle, but in practice not enough to maintain Nielsen and his family, so he had to go on taking on conducting engagements and playing his violin to support them. While he was still busy with rehearsals for the opera, Nielsen began work on his second symphony, and yet again it was inspired by a picture, one he saw hanging in a country pub, though no one's yet identified the pub, let alone the picture. He gave it the subtitle The Four Temperaments, which seems to imply some sort of programme, though the very idea was a Richard Straussian notion Nielsen rejected. I tried, he said, to elevate the idea behind the pictures to a different level. What the probably never-to-be-discovered picture depicted was indeed the 4 temperaments, themselves predicated on the concept of the 4 humours proposed by the classical Greek doctor Hippocrates: blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm, which were supposed to govern everyone's physical and mental characteristics. Robert Simpson points to the Second Symphony as striking out for Nielsen on what was to be a lifelong adventure, the study of human character. So the temperaments are the choleric, corresponding to the volatile nature, the phlegmatic or the lazy, the melancholic, and the sanguine, the optimistic. Yet Nielsen knew well enough that though we may all be able to assign ourselves to one category or another of these, we each carry within us elements of the other 3. Osmo Venska conducts the BBC Scottish Symphony Orchestra.
This is the podcast version of BBC Radio 3's Composer of the Week, your guide to a composer's life and work with Donald MacLeod.
Vårt gamle land av fall vår makt vi ugår sin rikdomsring. Vår fremmed seg og uforsatt om ei i store spring. Og bo og ploven landet, så skor og kulen vannet, stutt står den danske sømann på havet sin vikingvakt. På havet sin vikingvakt.
Even if, like me, you don't speak a word of Danish, the patriotic message of that song by Carl Nielsen comes over loud and clear. Du danske mand, the song of the fatherland. Nielsen wrote it for a review at the Tivoli Gardens, and though the show is long forgotten, Sing Danish Man of All Your Might has been popular ever since. Nielsen said that coming up with simple, strong tunes like that one cost him a lot more effort than writing much more complex music. In the spring of the year before he wrote that review, 1905, Nielsen decided to resign from his job as violinist in the theatre orchestra after 16 years' service. His continual conflicts with the management over a number of matters had finally come to a head. As he wrote to his wife, Marie, "The envy and opposition that I've encountered at the theatre has quietly reached a point that today I tendered my resignation. They've demanded that I should either play the violin in the orchestra like a harmless common soldier and be their subordinate, or that I should leave." They'd refused to appoint him as conductor of the orchestra, although they were happy to use him as a deputy on an ad hoc basis. "I am once more," he said, "an idle man in the street." Immediately after he'd handed in his resignation, Nielsen had a bout of serious heart trouble, but he wasn't idle for long, and he couldn't stay away from the theatre either. He'd already begun work on his opera Maskerade, and as soon as he'd recovered from his illness, he set to complete it, feeling that he'd never before worked so quickly and easily. Nielsen created quite a stir just with his choice of play to base the libretto on. He had the temerity to desecrate the sacred words of the Molière of the North, Ludwig Holberg, the 18th century dramatist who had been born in Bergen but lived most of his life in Denmark. Holberg satirized the pomposity and pretentiousness of his age, and it's been suggested that Nielsen may have had some of his contemporaries in mind as he apparently poked fun at 18th century manners. Maskerade was an immediate and lasting success, and it came to be regarded as the Danish national opera. The fact that his wife Marie insisted on pursuing her career as a sculptor even once they had 3 children was clearly a source of tension in the Nielsen household, especially when working on a project which kept her away from home for months at a time, as was so often the case. They moved house in 1906, and again 2 years later, both times to accommodate issues over Marie's studio, the second time because she needed a much bigger space. Against all the odds, she'd won a competition to create a monument to King Christian IX, who'd recently died. She became completely obsessed with this equestrian statue. It would take her 15 years to complete, and she took herself off to Germany for long periods to work in the place where they bred the special horses the king had favoured. Once again, Nielsen had to cope with keeping the family together unaided. One of his letters begins, "Hello? Is there anybody there?" During the same hectic period that he was working on Masquerada, Nielsen composed a string quartet in very much the same lively conversational spirit as the opera, especially, as you'll hear, in the last two movements. I said the opera had something of Mozart about it, and you may well get a sense, listening to the music of this quartet, of Nielsen's admiration for Mozart. Nielsen himself said once he'd heard it played through for the first time, "I'm starting to know the true nature of string instruments. It is indeed peculiar that one can court and cajole a tender being such as a string quartet for many years before she surrenders. Only now do I consider myself to have reached some sort of accord with its chaste, fugitive character." Some 3 years after Nielsen resigned from the Royal Orchestra, he finally got his wish when he was appointed conductor in August 1908. But though he began with high hopes, it went badly right from the start. He wasn't in sole charge. He had to share the appointment with the previous incumbent's assistant, Frederick Rung. The two men were chalk and cheese, and while Nielsen generally got more inspired performances, there was an acutely embarrassing incident when he lost concentration during a performance of Wagner's The Master Singers, and he lost his nerve. Rung had to step in and take over. Nielsen tried to rise above it, but it cast him into a deep depression. He felt persecuted as an artist and servant of the public, and in all respects trampled upon as a nonentity from all sides. Marie, once again, wasn't around to give advice and encouragement, but fortunately, in these increasingly difficult times, Nielsen had found very good friends in the Nergårds, Rolf Vigo and Bodil, a company who had a wide circle of artistic friends. For many happy summers in succession, Nielsen and his family would stay with them at their house at Fuglsang on Lolland, an island south of Jutland, which reminded him of his childhood home. Nielsen loved the atmosphere of their house and the riding, sailing and bathing in the sea on those holidays, away from the anxieties of life in Copenhagen. In spite of all these stresses and strains, he still managed to complete not only his violin concerto, but also his Third Symphony. Its phenomenal success established him as a composer to be reckoned with, who had finally, incontrovertibly, established his own voice on the international stage. The same exuberant sense of irrepressible vitality and optimism flows through the music of the symphony as the opera, though even more powerfully expressed. The outgoing, expansive music, which became known as the Sinfonia Espansiva, is quite simply a celebration of life. Nielsen himself said that the symphony expresses, in the first movement, a strong tension, espansiva, which, in the second movement, however, has been completely eradicated by idyllic calm. We're going to hear the third and final movement of the symphony, which, Nielsen said, is straightforward, a hymn to work and the healthy enjoyment of everyday life, a sort of general joy in being able to participate in the work of daily living and to see activity and capability unfold all around us.
You're listening to the podcast version of BBC Radio 3's Composer of the Week with Donald MacLeod.
On the road appears a ruddy peasant boy singing heartily and kicking his hat like a ball before him while he sings in a penetrating voice.
Farvel, min velsignede fødeby, min moders gryde ryger i sky, min faders kvie gumler på stald, min søsters hane sover på hal. Jeg vil løbe min vej.
You can see the handkerchief bundle bobbing up and down on the end of the stick over Axel Schurz's shoulder there as he strides out on the road to the big wide world, singing Asted, Off, set to music by Carl Nielsen, and a pretty accurate picture of Nielsen's own departure from the humble farmstead on the island of Funen in 1883. More than 30 years on, in 1914, it was Nielsen's friend Thomas Laub who, with missionary zeal, set out to reconstruct the old Danish folk songs and create a new, pure form of popular song. Laub had seen that Nielsen was just the man, with his ballad-like touch, drawing on his rich childhood heritage of song on the island of Funen to set words to a tune people thought they'd always known. Together they brought out 2 little books of songs called A Score of Danish Songs and published in 1915 and 17. At this time, Nielsen's conducting career wasn't going so well. In May 1914, he'd handed in his resignation as conductor at the Royal Theatre, but through his friend, the Swedish composer Wilhelm Steinhammer, he did manage to get some conducting work with the Gothenburg Symphony Orchestra, and there he found a much more consistently appreciative audience than he had back home in Copenhagen. Things began to look up the following year when Nielsen was elected conductor of Copenhagen's Philharmonic Orchestra. This position gave him the chance to exert some influence on the city's musical life and specifically to choose the repertoire of the orchestra. During the war years, Nielsen composed his next symphony, his 4th, which he called The Inextinguishable. He felt this represented a real breakthrough in his aim to represent the very urge and energy of life itself. When it was premiered in the new year of 1916, he made a breakthrough with the audience too. Their tumultuous response convinced Nielsen that the Danish public finally understood his music. Just after the end of the war, when he was deputizing for Steinhammer, conducting the Gothenburg Symphony Orchestra's concerts, he composed most of his suite for piano. He gave it the title The Luciferin, but soon realized this wasn't a brilliant choice. He apparently intended the title to be a reference to the Greek mythological figure Lucifer, the light-bearer, but the critics could perhaps be forgiven for looking for something demonic about the music. The suite's in 6 movements. The first begins calmly, but soon whips up a storm, though Nielsen said it should be played in a rather cold and restrained way. Towards the end of 1914, it emerged that Nielsen's wife, Marie, asked for a legal separation after she'd discovered he was having an adulterous affair. Aside from that bare fact, we know virtually nothing. When they donated all manner of artifacts and archival material to the state, Nielsen's daughters did so on the strict condition that their father's private life should remain private for the next 25 years. The composer's errant behaviour is apparently an acknowledged fact among Nielsen experts, but they've chosen not to put what they know in the public domain. We do know that Nielsen had an illegitimate child just before he met and married Marie, and that though she offered to adopt the boy, Nielsen was against it. We know too that in 1912, after an affair with a woman who worked at the Royal Theatre, a daughter was born called Rachel Siegmann. After the war, Nielsen did a lot of travelling all over Europe, being well received everywhere he went, but much though he wanted it, he still wasn't reconciled with Marie, though they did meet in Paris and revisited for the first time in 30 years the places where they'd first met and fallen in love. It wasn't until 1922 and in Berlin that husband and wife were finally reunited on the very day he finished his Fifth Symphony, which stands as Nielsen's masterpiece and a summation of his art. It was immediately after this that Nielsen threw himself into a new project, starting work on a wind quintet, which he said was a relief from the great tensions of the Fifth Symphony. It started from a phone call and some overheard Mozart. He called a friend one evening and heard a favourite Mozart piece in the background, which his friend explained he was in the middle of rehearsing with members of the Copenhagen Wind Quintet. Nielsen immediately went round to listen in. He composed his quintet then for 5 friends, with an affection and understanding that's instantly audible, lovingly tailored to suit their different personalities. We'll hear the final theme and variation movement, which Nielsen explained with characteristic reticence, referring to himself in the third person. Here the composer has sought to reproduce the characters of the various instruments. Here they chatter away at each other all at the same time. There they speak each for himself. Nielsen had to set aside his arduous work on his Fifth Symphony, sometimes working from 10 in the morning until 5 the next morning, to get another piece finished on time. His folk oratorio, Springtime in Funen, would become his most popular choral work. Nielsen immortalised the idyllic landscape and village life of his youth, including his father's music-making with his cronies, like the blind clarinetist known as Blind Anders. This is the episode introduced by solo clarinet, which stands at the centre of the work. As you'll hear, his playing delights the little children who skip and dance happily about. They're followed by a chorus of old folks glad to have the warmer weather of spring chase away their aches and pains. And the work ends with everyone joining in a whirling dance to welcome spring, with an almost sing-along chorus and a touching little hushed interlude where a couple gaze raptly at apple blossom falling from a tree. The whole piece radiates open-hearted charm, saturated as it is with cheerful folk-like rhythms. Nielsen was obviously au fait with other musical trends outside Denmark, and some say he was influenced by Schoenberg's 12-tone technique, which he supposedly used in the 3 pieces, as well as other late works. But the composer Robert Simpson, who championed Nielsen's music in this country in the second half of the last century, denies that there's any such response to the European avant-garde. For him, the originalities of Nielsen's last period are latent in his own early works. After a period of intense concentration on composition, Nielsen often succumbed to some kind of illness. When he finished the Fourth Symphony, it was a bad case of carbuncles. In 1922, after the very long hours he would put in on the Fifth Symphony, he had a serious attack of angina. It would be heart problems that would eventually kill him 9 years later. Nielsen was advised by doctors to give up riding. He loved horses, and he bitterly resented having to stop. He told friends he didn't want to live a life if it were going to be physically incapacitated. But then one day his friend and patron, the industrialist Carl J. Michelsen, made him a present of a Renault K3377. Nielsen, pushing 60, was instantly bitten by the motoring bug. It was best not to get in his way. His driving was notorious, and on one occasion, so the story goes, motoring along on the island of Funen, he found that though one wheel had come off, he was still able to drive along on 3. The lighter side of Nielsen's orchestral output includes incidental music to nearly 20 plays spread over his entire composing career, beginning in 1889. Some of the more memorable instances are his music for Sir Olaf He Rides in 1906, Tove the following year, Aladdin in 1918, and The Mother in 1920. There was a theatrical connection to an unusual piece he wrote in 1927, a rhapsodic overture, a fantasy journey to the Pharaohs. He dismissed it as no more than a piece of jobbery, but it's become a popular concert piece, compared at the time to Sibelius. This is a journey entirely of the imagination, because it was rather that the Faroe Islands came to Nielsen. He was asked to compose a piece to mark a visit by a group of islanders to give performances of their music and dancing at the Royal Theatre in Copenhagen. Nielsen planned to write concertos for all the wind instruments, but he only managed to complete the ones for clarinet in 1928 and for flute 2 years earlier. He wrote the flute concerto for Gilbert Jespersen, a member of the Copenhagen Quintet for whom he'd written the Wind Quintet we heard from yesterday. Though Nielsen composed this concerto when he was into his 60s, it has all the sense of fun that you'd expect of the teenage prankster captured in the photographs we have of him from the 1870s. Jespersen was a man of fastidious taste and delicate sensibilities, but Nielsen can't resist having a joke or two at his expense. He said in a programme note, "The flute cannot belie its true nature. It is at home in Arcadia and prefers pastoral moods. A composer must therefore fit in with its gentle nature if he doesn't want to be branded as a barbarian." But flying in the face of those strictures and playing a characteristic compositional gambit, he sets the fragile and delicate flute up with an unlikely dueling partner from the opposite end of the orchestral spectrum, a trombone, playing a very different buffoonish role here from its menacing presence in his Sixth Symphony. As Robert Simpson said, this coarse individual spreads itself all over the score with a grotesque and aimless blether, as if looking for something he's never even remembered to forget, while the aristocratic flute expresses its outraged sensibilities. Throughout the concerto, the tone is breezy, poetic, even idyllic, spiced up by some harsh interjections from the trombone, which, though they add excitement, don't disrupt the overall tone. In fact, through both movements of the piece, especially the flute in the first, both instruments seem to keep frantically searching for an ineluctable key and theme. The concerto was premiered in Paris in front of an appreciative audience which included Ravel and Roussel, and the following day Nielsen was made an officer of the Legion of Honor. That year, 1927, Marie began a marble portrait bust of her husband. It was a commission not from Copenhagen, but from the concert hall in Gothenburg in Sweden. There's a photograph of her posing with a bust, holding mallet and chisel, the sharp point aimed right at her husband's throat. On a misty evening in October 1930, Copenhagen, which had so often afflicted the composer, inflicted a potentially fatal blow. As he was crossing the street, he was hit by a tramcar and thrown some 20 feet. His injuries were remarkably slight, a dislocated shoulder and collarbone and concussion, but his family were alarmed about the effect of the shock and strain on his heart. He amazed them by the speed of his recovery. He was back at work within a month. The following year, he accepted the appointment of director of the Copenhagen Conservatoire, but he soon regretted it. He didn't like the stuffy formalities which came with the job, nor the reverential air of most of the people around him. His daughters were concerned to see how quickly he'd aged over a matter of months, his hair turning completely white. He confided in them that he was depressed by the prospects for his music. It seemed that unless he or another Danish conductor programmed his works abroad, they were rarely heard beyond Scandinavia. During rehearsals for a revival of Maskarada, one of the stagehands had a problem with the pulley system backstage. Nielsen leapt up to help and climbed to the top of the rope to sort out the snag-up. He hadn't given a thought to his weak heart. The next day he paid for this exertion and took ill. He was admitted to hospital and listened from his bed to a radio broadcast of his violin concerto on the 1st of October. He died the following night. His death came as a great shock. He was a man who'd struck everyone who met him with his vibrant vitality. Music which people had hoped to hear from him would now never be written. The fiddler boy from Funen, who'd often gone hungry as a child, was given a state funeral in Copenhagen Cathedral, attended by the king and queen, but amid the official pomp, many of the mourners broke down and cried. His wife Anna Marie's monument to her husband, a statue unveiled at his birthplace 2 years later, shows not the grand old man of Danish music, but a young barefoot boy sitting on a tree stump, obviously listening to something intently, a simple wooden flute in his hands. A few years earlier, Nielsen had been very impressed by a concert given by Copenhagen's Palestrina choir. Their conductor, Mogens Vildike, asked Nielsen to write something for the choir. He responded with a trio of motets setting verses in Latin from the Psalms of David. The final one sets words of triumphant thanksgiving from Psalm 31. Blessed be the Lord, for he hath showed me his marvellous kindness in a strong city. There's no doubt that Nielsen was recognised for the genius he was in his own country. The date of his 60th birthday, the 9th of June 1925, was declared a national holiday. He woke up to the sound of a brass band playing outside his window and came out wearing a purple silk dressing gown, which was a birthday present from his daughter Ermelin. He was made a Knight Commander of the Order of the Danish Flag, and in the evening there was a gala concert of Nielsen's music in the Tivoli Gardens, followed by a banquet in a prominent restaurant and a torchlit procession to round off the day. Nielsen received all this adulation with a gracious speech in which he said it was only by chance that he had become the man he was. That year he had begun work on his sixth and final symphony, Sinfonia Semplice, as he called it. As we've seen this week, all of Nielsen's symphonies offer some kind of mirror to the progress of his life. The composer's biographer, Jack Lawson, says that the sixth is the most biographical and least optimistic. In his later years, Nielsen himself said, "If my music has any value at all, then it is in one thing, that it has a certain current, a certain motion, and if that's broken, it's no good anymore." This is the composer who famously said, "Music is life, but the irrepressible life force which surges through the preceding 5 symphonies is tempered here." Illness, disillusionment with the lack of international success he'd had, and bewilderment at the state of modern music clouded Nielsen's mood. A distinct shadow of morbidity falls over the 6th Symphony. Nielsen confided to his friend Thorvald Nielsen that the ending could be interpreted as death knocking at the door. I'll end the week with the finale of the 6th Symphony. This is a set of variations for large orchestra, though some of them have the feeling of chamber music about them. As you'll hear, the final bars provide some rather perfunctory sense of resolution, but a resolution to do with resignation and defiance.
You've been listening to the podcast version of Composer of the Week, presented by Donald MacLeod. If you've enjoyed this podcast, you can find complete Composer of the Week programmes on BBC Radio 3, Monday to Friday at noon, and repeated at 10 p.m.